and welcome to History Pub. These months seem to go by really fast. So as usual, I want to thank Bart for hosting us in this wonderful venue. This building was built in 1908 and they started occupying it in December of that year. And it's the second building on this footprint on our historic Main Street. And I want to thank Zeth because we could not do this without his expertise with the sound. And Heather Endicott for her graphic designs to create our quarterly posters. And I want to thank Jim Lockhart for capturing all of these presentations on video. And those are available on the Cottage Grove Partners in History YouTube channel. And the past 2 years, 23 and 24, are on the CG Genealogy YouTube channel. And these are sponsored by the Partners in History here in Cottage Grove. And those are the Cottage Grove Historical Museum, the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society, the Cottage Grove Historical Society, the Cottage Grove City Library, Spirit of Bohemia Days, and that's Matthew Hewlett, and Oregon Aviation Historical Society and Singing Creek. And there are others in our community that support our efforts to preserve local history. The Partners in History have been raising funds to digitize the Cottage Grove Sentinel for quite a few years, and we have received a couple of good-sized grants, but we would like to turn this to the community and raise funds to digitize the 1970s. And so Kathy has some flyers, and if you're interested in helping us with this effort, you can mail a check to P.O. Box 142 to the Cottage Grove Museum, but make sure you put in the check line digitization or Sentinel digitization or something. And then there's also a hot link on their website, the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society's webpage and the Historical Society's webpage. So help us with that effort. Before I hand this off to Katie for the Historical Society, because they are the sponsor for tonight, I just want to invite you all to come to the Cottage Grove Community Center. The Genealogical Society started before the new year in the process to publish a book about all the veterans that served in World War II from our area, from Crestwell to Yoncalla, Lorraine to Diston. And in doing that research, we discovered 54 young men who gave their all in that effort. Yes, yes. And I decided that we should do something special to honor their efforts. And so I volunteered to make individual posters for every single veteran that was killed in action. And it was an honor to do that, but some of the stuff I can't unread. From the Battle of, Pearl Harbor, what started our effort in the war, to the Battle of Bataan, the Death March, the POW camps, the Battle of Layette, Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and there's even somebody that was in the Lost Battalion that the 442 came to their rescue, and he died the next day. And there's just a lot of really amazing stories that these men and their heroics, and I really hope that you can all go over and read their stories. And the reason why I did that is that there was a quote on a certificate for all of the veterans that died in service that are buried overseas. And it was a quote from General Pershing, and it says, "Time will not dim the glory of their deeds." But there are times that I think their time is forgotten. Their effort is forgotten. And so I wanted to help shine another light on that quote. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Katie with the Cottage Grove Historical Society. And the 50/50 raffle benefits us. So if you haven't purchased a ticket yet, please come down to this table here and get one. And it is my pleasure to welcome Ken O'Connell as our presenter today. Ken is 81 years old. He spent 50 of those years connected with the U of O Art Department to research the 100 years of history. He only had to really dig around in the first 50 years because he's been there. He says that we have each lived through part of these past 100 years, and so did our parents and grandparents. These life experiences might give us some background for what we're about to see and hear. Please welcome Ken O'Connell.
So I'm talking about the 100 years that preceded us here, and a lot of you will find things of interesting reference in them. The main thing is that I'm trying to pull out events and places and people. Now, so it's 100 years in 1 hour, or 100 years per hour, and about 100 slides. So this is a fraction of the 250 people that actually taught in the art department. And it does include some people from art education, Maud Kearns, and it includes some people from architecture and other programs. But by and large, these are primarily some of the oldest faculty members and some of the newest. And then there's all sorts of numbers. Some taught for a year, some taught for 44 years. So we'll begin. Now, behind it all is a man named Alan Eaton, who was very interested in folk arts. And way before there's an art department, way before there's an architecture program, he's teaching an art appreciation class at the University of Oregon. He graduates himself from the university in 1902, and then he ran the first bookstore and the first art store in Eugene. Hard to believe that there was somebody that did that in the first time. And he was interested in the daily crafts, the kind of handmade crafts. And so what happens in his career is he is very interested in public affairs, so he's in the state. He gets elected to the state legislature that represents Lane County 5 different times. But at some point, he moves back east and begins to work with the craft schools back there, the Campbell Craft School and the Penland School of Crafts. And he ends up writing a book about the handicrafts of the Southern Highlands. He ends up writing another book about the beauty behind barbed wire, the drawings and paintings he found from the Japanese Americans that were in the internment camps. And he was always looking at everyday art, handicrafts that were carved. And so he became kind of the dean of American crafts, as many people saw him. But he's sort of unknown to us because he's before all this. Although he plays a key role, he tells the president, Prince Lucian Campbell, about Ellis Lawrence, that he's seen him speak, he's seen his work in Portland, and so he suggests that he hire him as he does. Now, in 1912, if you were in 1912 and you wanted to study engineering, you'd go to the University of Oregon, because the University of Oregon had 3 engineering programs. But the head of the Oregon Agricultural College, which is what became Oregon State, went to the state board and argued that they dealt with agriculture and forestry and all these applied things, and they should have the engineering programs. And the state regency board decided to do that. And so Prince Lucian Campbell was quite upset. He lost 3 programs and decided that at that point he was going to add 3 professional programs. So that's how the School of Architecture and Art came, the School of Journalism, and the School of Business Administration. And that's why they're outside of the arts and sciences. Most schools have the arts and sciences as the whole umbrella for the liberal arts education. And U of O had that, but then they had these professional schools. Eventually, you have the School of Dance, the School of Music, all these other schools of education. Now, this is a picture of Prince Lucian Campbell, and that's the courtyard that's in the Art Museum. If you ever go to the Art Museum, there's a glass door, but you can go in there and you can walk around that courtyard. That was built a year after. I mean, it was already there. It was dedicated in as a memorial to Prince Lucian Campbell Hall, and PLC is named after Prince Lucian Campbell Hall, although most students going don't know that. So now Ellis Lawrence comes to the University of Oregon to do 2 things. He's campus planner, so he's laying out the new buildings. He's also designing buildings. He does Gerlinger Hall, he does the Art Museum, he does the Knight Library. And his background is that he graduates from MIT, which is the only real architecture program in the country at the beginning of the 1900s. And he wants to go to San Francisco and set up an office. But on the way, he stops in Portland to see his friends who were his fellow students. And at that year, 1906, there's a devastating earthquake in San Francisco, and the whole city is destroyed. And so he decides maybe he won't go down to San Francisco and set up an office. And so he sets an office up in Portland, And that leads to him designing buildings in the Portland area and in the end designing over 500 buildings. But also it helps him have this connection with the U of O. And so he comes down to the U of O and does the campus planning. And then in 1914, he becomes the dean of the School of Architecture and Art, eventually called the Architecture and Allied Arts. He loved the arts. He wanted arts in every building that he designed. And that's why U of O became unique in that it combined the arts with architecture. And up until probably the 70s, when things began to get very, very specialized, you would have classes that was a mixture of art students and architecture and art education and art history people. Now, these two buildings that you see, these are the Art Museum and the Night Library. And if you look at the top, you see these little alcoves. In those alcoves are the heads of famous people. And on the bottom of the screen are some of the heads that were carved. These were done by some of the students. He was always interested in portraiture and sculpture. And anybody he can find to do portraiture and sculpture, he hires them. And often the people he hired in sculpture, that was one of their specialties. Now, he didn't drive. He never learned to drive, so he came to Eugene once a week on the train, and there was on the electric train. And it's hard to believe, but in 1914 there were 5 electric trains a day coming to the U of O, coming to Eugene, and the Oregon Electric Station, which is still standing and was a restaurant, or has been a restaurant, and now it's a spaghetti house. That was the electric station, and it was right behind, as you know, where the regular diesel engine station is. Now, in the lower part, you'll see the electric train was all mahogany. It was very nicely done. It was really designed as business class, and it had about 2 or 3 cars, and then they would come down they had their own railway. The Osborne Hotel, which was the main hotel at that time, before the Eugene Hotel, would send a stage to pick them up, which they called it a stage. At this time, it's a bus. But there are cars and horse-drawn carriages and electric trains and diesel trains all going at the same time. Now, I was real interested about this electric thing. Here is the connections and the stations on the electric train from Portland to Eugene. And look at them. You know, they stopped at every little nook and cranny. I mean, they have these little names that I've never even heard of. But there's a group in Salem, I believe, that has a museum devoted to the electric railway and a lot of the things that took place in it. So, rather than going ahead to electric trains, we're going back to electric trains 100 years ago. Now, one of the first hires was Alfred Schroff from Boston, and he had been very successful in painting, and particularly landscape painting, and in stained glass. He'd won some awards in liturgical stained glass, and so he came, again, an architectural related art form, he came and taught stained glass. And these 4 stained stained glass windows, as well as more, are in Lawrence Hall today. You can as you walk up the staircase to go to the coffee bar on the 2nd floor, you'll see these stained glass windows. The second hire was Roswell Dosh, who was a sculptor. And in these days, Paris is the head of art all over the world's center in art. And if you wanted to really be educated, you went to Paris. And so Roswell, sent by his dad to Paris to study with Rodin, of course, one of the great figurative sculptors of the world. And he comes back and then is hired by Dean Lawrence. And you can see he does head sculpture. Now, one of the things in this is, I mentioned he was born in 1889. He studies in Paris in 1908 and 1910 with Rodin. And then he's hired in 1915 to teach sculpture. And it's the first organized sculpture class in the Northwest. In the spring, he's drafted into the Army, and Prince Lucian Campbell pleads with the service to not send him overseas, that they need him back here as a teacher. So he's trained in San Francisco and then comes back to Oregon, but he's assigned to Reed College. Well, in that same year, in 1918, he catches the influenza, which is the Spanish flu, and 100 years ago, and has also pneumonia and pleurisy, and dies at age 29. He's one of the faculty who stayed very short time compared to those that stayed a long time. The other picture at the bottom, by the way, these 2 that are white are plasters, and they're covered with a certain sealer to preserve them, and then a bronze mold is made from that, and then from the bronze mold, bronze casting is made, and you see these bronze here. But that lady is Abigail Duniway. Abigail Duniway was the first woman to register to vote when women were allowed to vote in 1913, and she's registered in the Multnomah County. Now, her brother was the editor of the Oregonian at that time, who was completely opposed to women voting. So you had in the same family two. She was a women's suffragette, traveled the country with Susan B. Anthony, and then lectured before the legislature to try to get them to approve the women's voting rights. Okay, so Roswell's father. Here's Roswell behind him. Roswell's father was a Civil War veteran and had been assigned with a group of other people to design the Seattle World Expo that was held at the same time that Roswell was down in Eugene teaching. And it used the University of Washington's grounds as the location. And there weren't many buildings at that time at the University of Washington. It was still in its early stages, but the buildings that were left from this exposition became some of the original buildings at University of Washington. So now the next hire, one of the next hires was in ceramics, Victoria Ross. And she's the one who taught in Eugene. She taught for over 44 years, which is a long time for a teacher to be teaching. Now, again, most of these people studied ceramics. They were practicing artists, but they didn't have degrees. So one of the things that Dean Lawrence did is in the summers he wanted them to take courses and get a bachelor's degree, because he knew down the line if they didn't have a degree, they probably wouldn't be able to stay in the university. Her focus was glaze design, glaze mixing. And so you see up here a glaze test set that she would have them take a certain set of chemicals and mix them in varying proportions with various coloring agents, and then they would do glaze tests. And that was the first term. All the first term was that. Nobody was making any pottery. Now the two pieces of pottery you see are hers, the ones that she did. In fact, this is another two that were in the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, which used to be up in Portland when it existed, and they collected a lot of art from Oregon artists, and this was in one of the books that they wrote about the collection. Now, Everett Fairbanks, another sculptor, he was hired, and you can see a very young guy. He was hired, and he didn't have a degree, and so he went to school at UW, and he went to school at Yale, and he went to school in various other places. And in fact, he went to Paris for a while, so that he built up his credentials. But he was hired at first to do these two relief designs for the power and heat plant at the U of O. And if you look at the little photograph in the lower right, it shows the building as it exists today. This was the original power plant at the U of O, and these two panels still exist. One of them is on one side of a hallway and one's on the other side. And the one on the left is all about power. You see the word power in the lower part. And then you'll see up here an AF up at the top, right along the edge. I did have a pointer that I could use at some point, but here's his initials, AF, and then here's the word power, and then you have this guy who's pulling these pulleys, and then this is on heat, because they produce the power and heat for the university, and then his name again is down on the bottom, I believe here. Over. And so here, this is heat. Now what does this guy do? He's blowing in this, because the university was heated by steam, and these days the whole university had steam pipes going under all of the buildings, and all of the buildings were heated. During the Columbus Day storm, and I don't know where you were during the Columbus Day storm that we had in Oregon, it was the largest wind, sleep fluid. It tore down trees all over the state, and the power was all out in Eugene, except the University of Oregon, because they had their own power plant, and so you could walk by the university, the lights were still on, heat was still going. Now, Everett did a lot of different sculpture and relief work. One of his pieces you can see in Portland along Burnside Street was dedicated to a very important and powerful fire chief who died in 1911. He was putting out a fire, his team was putting out a fire in the warehouse district, and he was afraid that one of his men might still be in the building. So he went over to open the door, and immediately the whole building collapsed on him. So this very popular and well-loved fire chief died, and he did a bronze sculpture relief for him. His name was David Campbell, and you'll find that on Burnside and about 18th. There's a triangular block. I've always wondered what that was all about. There's a kind of an unusual block, and it has a little fountain, one of the early fountains in Portland, and it's dedicated to this fellow. Now, another interesting connection to Oregon State is his brother, Leo, who claims to have taught him to be a sculptor, moved to Oregon in 1923 and started the art department at Oregon State. In fact, it's in a building that is now called Fairbanks Hall, based on his last name, Leo's Fairbanks. And so again, you have these interesting connections over time with people in the state. Now, Avery moved on from U of O to Michigan, University of Michigan, headed the sculpture there, and then he did a lot of work for automobiles. He did this wing goddess for sort of radiator cap, and he did the Ram for the Dodge Ram, and he did the piece for the Chrysler, and he was awarded, one of the things he was given was a brand new 1932 red Chrysler Royal 8. And you see him here carving a figure for Lincoln. He was hired by a lot of state capitals to do carvings of famous people because that was one of his great skills. Now, Maud Kearns, again, an early hire. We're in the 20s now, at the beginning of the 20s. Maud Kearns graduated from the U of O, and I thought she started her teaching in Seattle, but I was informed today by one of your historians that she started teaching really in Lebanon and near Marcola. Now, she starts out, in those days, art education was called the normal school. My great-grandmother was a teacher in a normal school in the Midwest, and she studied at a normal school. Now, Maud Kearns starts out painting. She loves to paint, and so you'll see her paintings are not unlike the paintings being done at that time by the men, although they're more colorful. As George O'Keeffe said, the men were using darker colors and more muddied colors, and so the women brought in these bright colors. Now, the building in the upper left-hand corner is today's location of Maud Kearns Art Center. She devoted her house to a center when she was alive, and then that became the Art Center, and then it was eventually named after her. Now, Maud Kearns was a very interesting person. In Seattle, she taught in Seattle both at the University of Washington and in the public school. And she had her photograph taken by Imogene Cunningham, one of the great American photographers. And so the picture of her there with the amazing hat was by Imogene Cunningham. Now, she met Gertrude Warner. Gertrude Warner was a very wealthy woman who basically moved to Eugene with her husband because her son was a lawyer, a professor at the University of Oregon. And she brought with her a huge Asian collection. She and her husband lived in China for about 10 years. He was working for the government, U.S. government, and they collected art from China, Japan, and Korea. And so they brought all this art, and at some point they decided to give it to the U of O if the U of O will build a museum. And so the U of O museum was originally called the Oriental Art Museum because it was primarily Asian art. She attends, but she continues to take workshops, and she began to study with abstract painters, Hans Hofmann and a number of painters in the East Coast and West Coast. And then her paintings get shown at the Guggenheim, and they use one of her paintings as the advertisement in Art News, photographing on the art of tomorrow, which the Guggenheim sort of devoted itself to primarily modern art and particularly abstract art. And so if you were in that area, you always had some connection with the Guggenheim. Okay, now this is sort of a timeline to kind of put it in perspective. So you had these people, Alan Eaton in the early days, Roswell, Alfred, and then Victoria Avakian, and then Avery Fairbanks and Maud Kearns. Now, other people begin to come. Andy Vincent comes in 29. We'll go back to the 20s in a minute. But Andy Vincent comes in the 29s, and he teaches until the 1970s. And he is one of my teachers. And so now we'll look at it in terms of world events. So World War I is on at 1914 to 1918. And then as the World War ends, the Spanish flu erupts. And the reason it was called the Spanish flu is that most of the countries that fought in the war agreed to not advertise deaths by this flu because they were afraid it would panic the world population. So the only country that didn't have a restriction on their news was Spain. And so Spain reported more and more cases of this flu. And so it got called the Spanish flu. Although the Spaniards were convinced it was the French flu. And so they called it the French flu. And but it's ironic. It seems amazing that it's 100 years later we have COVID-19. And so then in the early 1920s, again, you have feature films. You go from the silent to the talkies. And in 1925, Buster Keaton comes here for a year, and from 1925 and 26, and makes his film, The General. So you're on my timeline now. And U of O offers the first MFA. MFA was the highest degree you could get in the studio arts. and it was called the Masters of Fine Arts. And U of O and UW were the first two in the country to offer, although Harvard claims they were the first one, but Harvard has a better press agency than some of the other schools. And then, of course, you have the Depression, the Dust Bowl, and then World War II. So this is sort of 25 years. This show is kind of in 25-year segments. Now, I mentioned these different events, and then here's Andy Vincent on the left. He's a painting teacher and dressed up very nice, Argyle socks and everything. And here's Lance Hart, who's painting murals. Murals were very common. If you were a painter, you painted a mural in the 1920s, 1930s, and then during the WPA, there were murals in post offices and airports and all sorts of public buildings. Now, Andy also painted a large mural that's now on the walls of Lawrence Hall called The Good Life of Lane County, and that's what you see. And in those days, a lot of painters like to work with grids, and you can see kind of an underlying horizontal and vertical grid, although you have these people and farm produce and deer in the background. I'm pointing to my screen, of course, it doesn't help you, but I'll try to give you directions. I figured so if I use the pointer, so this is the painting I'm talking about. That's Good Life in Lane County. Then this is a 50-foot mural he painted behind in the city hall. That was every month they had a city council meeting, and it was televised. And this was the background, was his painting. And this is a section of it. It's called Open Color, where the lines are drawing of the building, but the color kind of flows back and forth between the buildings. This is another painting he did at the house of one of the architects, William Stafford's house. Okay, now I become a member of the faculty in 78, and this is a picture I take of the faculty, the upper one, in 1982. Dave Foster is the department head, and these are some of the faculty. And then below in black and white, these are photographs I took when I was department head, and they were at the first faculty meeting of the year, and then it became a flyer to advertise our art exhibit. So everybody in the art department had a piece of artwork that was on display in a gallery in the school, and I would send these all over the country. And and in 1988, I sent one to Andy Vincent. I thought, well, he was living on the coast in Brookings, painting, and he was later in life, and he had, like I say, retired. He'd been there from 29 to 72. And I said, Andy, look at this. The program has doubled and tripled in size, and we're teaching all sorts of expanded courses all over the arts, and you would be proud. And so I sent it to him, and about a week later, I got a letter back from him, and he said, Ken, thanks for the postcard, but these faculty, what a bunch of bums. There's not one tie in the whole group. There's not one dress that the women are wearing. You just look like a bunch of people off the street. And when I realized that everybody wore ties in the early days in schools. In fact, one of the universities back east required you to wear your cap and gown to teach, and that would be very uncomfortable, I think. So anyway, so the next year I asked the faculty if they'd please wear a tie, but I could only get one woman to wear a dress. Apparently that is really hard to do nowadays, and that would be the woman in the back with the black hair, and you can't really see the dress. Well, I guess she has one leg there, you can see part of it. Anyway, so I sent this to Andy, but I didn't hear from him again, from that. So back to the 20s. Okay, now, so Andy comes in 28 or 29, and Harry Poole Camden comes in 28, and he does the carvings that are in the Leawood power plant of Eugene. If you go up the McKenzie River, McKenzie Pass, as you get to the dam up there, there's a power plant that was designed by Lawrence in the Art Deco style, and it has on it these three sculptures of power and light and heat. And then what happens is Camden then goes to Cornell University, and he wins a huge sort of funded sculpture project to do these huge figures in the U.S. exhibit in the World's Fair, 1939 World's Fair in New York. After that, he joins World War II and dies in combat. So here's another faculty who comes to the U of O, then goes on to do things in the World's Fair, then gets involved in the war and dies. So here's a comparing sort of Avery Fairbanks and Camden's two relief sculptures. These are called sort of 2.5D. They're not really 2D. they're not really 3D, but they're sort of, they come out of the wall in a sculptural way. Okay, so I've given this talk at least 12 times, and every time somebody gives me new information or asks me a question that I can't answer. And one question was, who did those pan figures in that U of O's museum courtyard? And it turns out that Oliver Barrett is the one who did those figures, and he did a fountain in Portland called the Sheminsky Fountain, which is in the park blocks near the Portland Art Museum at the north end of the park blocks. So if you're in Portland and you're wandering through the park blocks, the Sheminsky Fountain is one of the oldest fountains there, and it has this Rebecca of the Well is the theme of the sculpture in bronze. And the pan figures were modeled after a fellow. When I moved to teach in U of O in 1978, the gardener I hired said that he was the model for those pan figures when he was a young kid. And he modeled, of course, for both of them. Now, that courtyard, by the way, was carved. The capitals at the top of at the very top of each of the columns, you have a capital, and these are the things that are on them. They're the birds and the flora and fauna of Oregon. And this is a fellow, Richard Bach, who was Frank Lloyd Wright's sculpture assistant. So Frank Lloyd Wright met him in Chicago, where Richard Bach, who had been trained in Germany, was in Chicago working for architects, doing, if they needed a sculpture in front of their building, or if they needed some sculpture along the side of the building, he would be hired to do it. Eventually he joins Frank Lloyd Wright, and together they work on many, many buildings. He also was, like I say, a sculptor, and he carved Billy Rivers. Billy Rivers was one of the famous, well-loved janitors of the time, and Lawrence wanted him to do that. Also, Bach came at a time when Warner's collection in the Art Museum is being installed, and she had a lot of broken pieces and a lot of things that in shipping were damaged, and so she hired him to glue them together again and put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And now he was an interesting fellow. He taught sculpture. He was sort of retired, and he was doing this just as a short-term thing. Eventually he goes to California, and he wants to write 2 books about sculpture, the sculpture techniques and the history of sculpture. And in one of his classes is Glenn Gardner, an architecture student. Glenn Gardner is a very ambitious architecture student. He's part of the city council. He wants to get into city planning. And he asks Richard Bach, do you have the address of Frank Lloyd Wright? And he says, yes, I do. And Glenn Gardner writes to Frank Lloyd Wright and says, come to the U of O and give us a talk and show your work. And Frank Lloyd Wright eventually phones Richard Bach and says, I get 12 letters from this student wanting me to come to U of O. Is that a real legitimate place? Is that actually? And Bach says, oh yeah, it's really a nice school. You should come here. So he comes to U of O, sets up an exhibit of his work, gives a talk, unbeknownst to any of the architecture faculty. And one of the things I found in this is that students take initiative. They were sort of taught to take initiative, but they don't always tell the faculty what they're doing. And so here, this famous architect comes, and nobody knows about it. So Lawrence hears about it. He comes down on the electric train from Portland, or I don't think they may not have had the electric train by that time. And he has a big reception, and everybody meets Frank Lloyd Wright, and everything is taken care of. But Gardner raised the money to bring him from his fraternity and from the architecture students. And I find this as a going theme, the initiative that the students would take that happens in Oregon and in the West, where we're not so threatened or overwhelmed by the administration, that we actually could, at the lower levels, make a difference in things. Now, one of the stories you hear about Frank Lloyd Wright, nobody knew any of this stuff I'm telling you now until I did this research. The only story we knew about Frank Lloyd Wright is that he came to the U of O. We didn't know how or who invited him, and that he was given a tour of the campus, and as he walked to the art museum, from the back side, he saw these beautiful columns or beautiful cubic shapes, and he thought this was stunning, this was amazing. And then he goes around to the front of the museum, and it's just flat. And he says, oh, that's terrible, that's terrible. So what turns into a compliment turns into an insult. And he says he thinks that Lawrence would have been a more famous architect had he done to the front what he did to the back. And anyway, I've always wanted to see Frank Lloyd Wright's work, because at this time, the reason Bach separated from it is that Frank Lloyd Wright was invited to go to Japan and design the Imperial Hotel for Tokyo. Okay, well, I always wanted to see it, and I've been to Japan many times, but of course it was torn down in '68, so I couldn't see it. And so when I heard that it had been rebuilt by the Japanese, I was stunned, and I found out that in Nagoya, near Nagoya, there's a huge park devoted to old buildings in Japan. And they have moved them from wherever they were, the first Christian church in Japan, the first tavern in Japan, and this is Frank Lloyd Wright's Imperial Hotel. The front facade and the front lobby and the restaurant has been completely reconstructed. The Japanese are often obsessive compulsive about these things, and they took apart that building and labeled every brick so they could reconstruct it sometime in the future. So the future came, and they did that. So anyway, I got to go in it. So I went to this, I walked in it, and you see the wonderful use of light that Frank Lloyd Wright made possible by carving parts of the bricks that were used and things. Also, Frank Lloyd Wright was what we found in modern times as a comprehensive designer. He designed the tableware, he designed the dishes, he designed the lamps, he designed the chairs, he designed the clothing that the waitresses would wear, and his wife by this time is a sculptor because Bach has stopped working for him, so his wife designs this fountain. Now, one of the people that he works with or gets to know is Art Clough. Now, Art Clough is another one of those unusual characters that we don't know too much about, but he comes to Eugene and he's fascinated by Eugene history, and he gets involved with lumber mills, and he's a carver, so he does a lot of carving, and he does signs, and he's fascinated by the Bristol history and the lost wagon train and these things, and he gets involved in these annual events, these annual fairs celebrating Oregon history. Well, these are some of his panels in the Oregon in the Oregon collection, or now it's called the Special Collection, that's on the second floor in the Knight Library. And you'll see 6 panels. These are 3 of them. They're 8 feet tall and about 2.5 feet wide, and they're 3 on one end of the building or the room and 3 on the other. And each of them has a different mountain in Oregon. Each of them is dedicated to one of the great mountains in the Cascades. And then in this section, in this middle, this is where the pioneers meet the Native Americans, and so you have mountain men and Indians meeting here. Then on the bottom he has the CCC workers. Now, for those of you that don't know, CCC meant Civilian Conservation Corps. It was developed by Roosevelt to deal with the Depression, where people were out of work, and if you worked there, you would get $5 a week, and then they would send $5 a week to your family, so that young men, many of whom had never really had a job, were working for the Conservation Corps. They used a lot of military surplus clothing for these guys. Some of these guys had never had shoes, and they came from all parts of America. And they used old retired military people to run these camps. And you had this sort of Eleanor got involved. A lot of people say they came up with the idea. Eleanor Roosevelt says she did. Actually, Art Clough said he came up with the idea of the CCC. And as Kennedy said, that success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. And so that many people, but this was a very successful program all over the country. And then down here, unbeknownst to most people, these are panels about the Depression. And you have pictures of, here's a husband and wife hugging each other as this man is auctioning off their farm. And over here you have the police beating up these people who were doing a jobless picket at the White House. And then this one is here's a guy running, and this guy's running to catch a train. And here's a train in the background, here's a wheel, here's one of the cars. This guy's fallen on the ground, and this guy has grabbed a hold of one of the railings and is about to pull himself on the train when somebody sitting up there sticks his foot on his hand. And over here I found what was unusual. It looks like 1225530. I thought it might be in the name of the train, so I looked up that. But then I realized, no, that's a date. That's December 25th, 1930. That's Christmas Day. And this was probably a story. The CCC workers were in Eugene because they had a large camp there in Windling, and his vocational school was right close to it. I can see one saying, on Christmas Day we were trying to hitch on this train, and can you believe it? On Christmas Day this guy kicks us off or whatever. Anyway, so you have all sorts of different things going on. Now, vocational school. So Art Clough is the one who really starts the vocational school in Oregon. That's what he wants to do, is teach vocational school. And he goes to Chicago to visit Moholy-Nagy, who was the guy who started the Bauhaus in Chicago and came from the Bauhaus in Germany. When the Nazis closed down the Bauhaus, he came and brought a lot of the teachers from Germany to Chicago. And Art is very interested in how education can deal with applied things, with people who are working in the industry. Now, well, this is a close-up. I wanted to show you again, a close-up of his carving. It's just amazing. Here's another one of people dancing. Here's people dancing. Here's the band up here. Here's the horn. Here's the drum. And then here are three guys cooking a potato over a fire with a train behind. Okay, now let's see. Oh yeah, I have names of those dancing the trail. By the way, Arts Clough students were commissioned to do carvings in the Department of Forestry in Salem. Now this building exists to this day, and these are the stairways and the panels done by the students. They're just amazing and beautiful. Of the flora and fauna of Oregon, there are 27 panels done, and Art was just amazing in what he did. Also, he and his students developed a manual for a new propeller blade that Boeing developed that they wanted to have put on and replacing other propeller blades, but the mechanics couldn't figure it out. It was very complex. So they hired Art and his students to make a manual, and they used overlays, transparent overlays, to show how the thing was to be assembled. And it was so successful that he got an award and was recognized by the government, and Eleanor Roosevelt came to Eugene to give him this honor and to thank him for the work, for the war effort. Now, the Eugene Hotel claims that she stayed there at one time, and it was during the time that she comes here for him. Okay, Art Clough also wanted to design the new Capitol. The old Capitol was all wood, and it burned down in 1935, and so they wanted to build a new one out of stone, as most of the state capitals did. But almost all the state capitals have a dome as their main feature, and he wanted to have something that was Oregon, that symbolized Oregon. So he designed a tree trunk as being the outstanding figure with a lumberjack on the top, and so that was his design, and it was carried out by a fellow in New York that got the commission to do it. And then this bottom is a sculpture by one of the U of O grads that was in the park in front of the Capitol. In the CCC camps, they had artists, and it turns out some of the U of O faculty were artists in the CCC camps. Jack Wilkinson was up at Odell Lake, David McCosh was at Willow Springs, Illinois, and Harlow Hudson was at Glacier National Park, Wendling, and Skinner's Butte. If you're ever at Skinner's Butte, there's a building in the middle of the park called the Lamb Cottage. That was built by the CCC workers. If you go and look at that, you can see it's totally CCC style and stuff. Okay. Oh, this is the David McCosh's painting, and here's the one that Harlow Hudson did. The reason I know about this is this. I met this woman, Kathleen Duxbury, who did this book on CCC art. Her father was in charge of one of the CCC camps, and she has devoted a lot of her latter years, and her husband, into researching libraries and finding out material about the CCC as well as the WPA. Okay, now Harlow Hudson, who did that painting, becomes a student of architecture, and this is one of the costume balls they have once a year, or they did in those days, and he's dressed up as a piece of furniture made out of cardboard. And he's a poor student, so he can't really do very well, but he eventually becomes a faculty, and in one of the faculty costume parties, he builds out of wood a set of cabinets that he wears as his costume. And I wish I had a picture of that. And then this is where the whole school got together, and they all chimed in. The art department made the clay ornament that became the medallion that was your ticket to the potlatch, and they would all go over to Florence and make bouillabaisse in huge containers and fry steaks and potatoes and play music and fly kites, and the architects would build temporary structures. Okay, a couple things now. The School of Journalism has this wall. This was done originally outside by this woman here, but now it's on the inside because they built over and around it. And these again are some of the heads that you'll see when you look up close in these buildings, the Library and Art Museum. Okay, this is the courtyard where painting was done. There's the model there. The model is over here, sitting there with an umbrella, and here you have the art students standing around working on their paintings. Here we go. This is another collaboration. This is between Michael Bueller, who was a painter, and Eiler Brown, who was a faculty member in the architecture program. And Eiler Brown is very interested in painting and printmaking, and he and Michael Mueller become good buddies, and they go out on these expeditions to paint in Eastern Oregon and Central Oregon. And on one of the trips to Eastern Oregon, Mueller has terrible pain in his right side and has to be taken to the hospital. And the nearest hospital is Bend. Eiler drives all night to get Mueller to the Bend Hospital, where unfortunately he dies of complications with appendicitis, a ruptured appendicitis in 1931. But during his time, he was very interested in collecting rocks and collecting stones and fossils. And you know, this is the time when Luther Cressman finds these sagebrush sandals, these sandals made out of bark, cedar bark sandals. And now if you go to the Natural History Museum, they've got dozens of these sandals they found in more and more caves. Anyway, Luther Cressman found these sandals below the layer of ash from the eruption of Crater Lake. So he knew these sandals were older than Crater Lake. And he explained in various conferences that the Indians were in Oregon before Crater Lake, because the Indians have legends of the mountain exploding, but nobody believed him, because that's not possible. Any Indians were here earlier than 3,000 years ago, and this would be 9,000 years ago. But because they didn't have carbon-14 dating at that time, but as you got closer to World War II, they developed carbon-14, and these sandals were one of the first dozen objects tested and proved that it was, 9,000 years old. Okay, Gordon Gilkey's in the center here. Gordon Gilkey and Eiler Brown became buddies, and Gordon Gilkey started as a painter, but he learned to do printmaking with Eiler Brown, and together they built an etching press. There already was an etching press in art education that Maud Kearns had, but art education sometimes didn't have much communication with the fine arts people down below, so they couldn't use her press, so they had to build their own press. And in so doing, they worked together, and Gordon Gilkey then did his MFA in etching of the building of the library. Now, Gordon Gilkey goes on to teach at OSU and becomes a dean at OSU. But part of his time when he's after his MFA, he's in New York and D.C. and he goes to Roosevelt. He sends a note and Roosevelt buys some of his prints, and so he gets a chance to talk to him. And he says, when this war is over, there's going to be a lot of art that has been dislocated and broken, and that there should be a group of people, a special group in the services that go around to claim the art and restore it and find its rightful owner, and which becomes the monument men. And so he was one. When that happens, Gordon Gilkey is one of the monument men. So he goes and travels around Europe, learning a lot about Europe, of course, and the art that was there. Now the left is one of his etchings of the building of the Knight Library. And he loved architectural things, and so this is a thing he does actually in New York as well. And then on the right is Constance Fowler. She was, again, a true Oregonian. She taught at Willamette University most of her career, and she was the art department at Willamette University. But before that, she goes to school at the U of O, gets her MFA in printmaking. So she's one of the early printmakers, and she's doing wood engraving, which means you're using the end grain of the wood to carve. It's very hard, and you're carving in. It's almost like etching. It really is like a form of etching. Okay, Lance Woodhart. I think that Lance is known primarily for teaching drawing and painting and art history, but he had a heart attack and a stroke, and he couldn't speak, and so he needed to hire someone to help him, and it so happens he is a neighbor of Robert Motherwell. Now, this is one of Lance Hart's paintings when he was stationed up in Fort Lewis in Washington. I love this painting. It has that Oregon, Washington mist and the mud puddles and the rain and the large raincoats and stuff. Anyway, he was one of the few faculty to write a book, and he wrote a book on basically drawing the figure. That was one of his specialties. But he needed to hire someone to help him teach, especially art history, where there's a lot of talking. So Robert Motherwell, who was one of the early abstract painters, grew up in Glen Eden Beach in Washington, and his parents' house was next to the Lance Hart's house. And he, in his biography, Robert Motherwell says Lance Hart was the first artist he ever met. Well, Robert Motherwell eventually moves to New York and becomes one of the famous of the abstract painters. But before he does that, he teaches for 1 year at U of O. And I did find an architecture faculty who was in the painting class, and he said that it was a little bit problematic because Lance couldn't speak and Motherwell wouldn't speak. And so Motherwell was busy speaking in art history, but I guess when it came to painting, he didn't have a lot of things to say. So you have these interesting things. Another person that nobody really knew much about was Jack Wilkinson's wife. Una Wilkinson was a very accomplished painter. And on the right is a mural she did at the Art Institute in San Francisco of, again, wildlife and farming in and around California. And she assists Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera is hired to paint a mural on Treasure Island during the Golden Gate International Exposition. And but she's there to assist because he paints very thin and a lot of cracks occur. So she's there to basically repair some of the work he does. But he's very startled to see her because when she comes there, he wasn't introduced to her, and he carries a revolver in his pocket because Trotsky, one of his friends, was assassinated in Mexico at this time, and he's afraid that as being a public figure, painting this thing during the day, that someone's going to assassinate him. Of course, they never do, but he carries his pistol anyway. And so another part of history. Okay, so now we have the sort of area of the 40s into the 60s, from World War II to the Vietnam War, and you have faculty is increasing. And what happens in Maud Kearns, let me show you, we'll take Maud Kearns as an example. So Maud Kearns here starts the art education program, and then she has a student, graduate student, Jean Kendall Glazer, who takes over for her. She's her graduate student. And then she ends up working with David Foster, who comes and becomes a graduate student working with her while she's a faculty at the U of O. And David Foster goes on to teach design and in the art department and in the architecture and in art education in three different departments. Now, I did something to find out where people came from. All the people at the top are from Chicago. These three came from the Chicago Art Institute. These 5 were at the Institute of Design, which is the school that Moholy-Nagy designed, and was the whole idea was that technology was beginning to take over manufacturing in a huge way, and yet artists and designers were not involved. And so Moholy-Nagy's whole theory was you've got to get artists and designers involved in the manufacturing of these products. Now, Jean was the only one who actually worked with Moholy-Nagy. By the time that these 4 are at the Institute of Design, Shermayeff and other faculty are running the Institute of Design, but it's a very intense school and very rigorous. Buckminster Fuller teaches there. They have musicians and engineers teaching there, visiting artists. Other people, of course, Cranbrook Academy of Art, Yale, San Francisco Art Institute, University of Iowa, and then Alfred was a ceramic school, although they taught all the arts there too. And University of Iowa became a huge school in the 80s in terms of producing students. Now, one of the things is that various companies would come to the Institute of Design and say, help us with this design. So the Lever brothers in 1953 they had a thing called Project X, and they wanted to come up with a new idea for soap because the soap had been the same cube for years. And so they went to the Institute of Design, and it was Paul Tetzner's class that was asked to do it. And Paul came up with 2 ideas, one for liquid soap and one for soap that was shaped in a curve so it would fit your hand and it would also fit your body when you're taking a bath. Now, since then, they've come up with 3 sort of variations on it, but the Lever brothers looked at it and they said, oh, liquid soap, that'll never go. Nobody will ever do that. So we're not going to even consider that. We're going to go something with one of these shapes. And so they start out with a shape at the top and then they modify it a little bit as things go. And Paul used to say it's a great soap to, when you're taking a bath to scrub with and wash with. He says, but if you set it on the side of the tub, it slides off because there's no flat surface. It's all curved surfaces. So that was its only disadvantage. That's why I think they developed the second one that has a few flat surfaces so it'll stay on the bathtub. Anyway, then another interesting thing, again, student-inspired, is Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller came to the U of O in 1953, and he was there for 7 days. The students and the faculty decided, he builds domes, let's build a dome. And what do we have here? Wood. Let's build a wooden dome. He'd never built a wooden dome. So for 7 days and 7 nights, the whole faculty and all the students stayed up working in shifts, and they built this dome. Now, here Fuller's lecturing about different things, and then you see the dome in partial built. So here now the dome is finished. It is basically only the second dome he's built in a public setting. The first one was at Ford Motor Company. He'd done, of course, lots of models for himself. And so now, of course, there are over 300,000 domes all over the world, and the second one was built here in Oregon at the U of O. And near the stage of finishing the dome, he wants to cover it with something. So he phones up DuPont. Now DuPont knows Buckminster Fuller. He's known in all of the industries because he's constantly butting heads with them. But he asked DuPont, do you have a film or something that they could put over the dome? And DuPont said, well, we'll ship out tomorrow. We'll fly out to you this new product called VisQueen. We haven't put it on the market yet, but you can use it and cover the dome. So they have a way to cover the dome, and now you see it lit with it, and that helped keep the water out for a while. But as you know, the key problem of domes is water seams. Anyway, Fuller was so impressed with the students that worked with him that he asked Larry Bissett to go with him on his next project, which was to go to Colorado and build another dome at the Aspen Conference, and then to go to MIT and build another dome. So he took one of the U of O's architecture students, who then launched his career sort of working with Fuller and going around. Anyway, this is some of the students gathered with Fuller to take a photograph of the dome in the background, and there's the only faculty I could find in here was Jack Wilkinson, and he's sticking his head over. If you know Jack Wilkinson, he had a bald head. There's Jack here, and here's Dave Foster's head, and then here's Bucky Fuller. And here they're talking about the geodesic dome designed and built by the students and the faculty. So one of the students that actually was responsible for all of that was Kenneth Snelson. He studied painting. His dad had a drugstore in Pendleton. He grew up in Pendleton. His dad also sold art supplies. So Kenneth Snelson comes down here, as many people did, to study architecture, but they sort of drift out of architecture into fine arts, and he was taking painting. And basically he wanted to be a painter, studied with Jack Wilkinson. But he goes to the school at that time. He's been in the service, and so he goes to Black Mountain College I think it's in South Carolina, North Carolina, I can't remember. Yeah, and North Carolina. And he studies with Albers. Joseph Albers, again from the Bauhaus, comes, and Joseph Albers is a color theorist, and he's amazed at Kenneth Snelson's advanced painting skills, and he asks him, how did you do this? Well, I had this teacher named Jack Wilkinson. And then he says, oh, by the way, Kenneth, that we have a new teacher coming. De Kooning couldn't make it to come, so we have this new guy he's never taught before. His name's Buckminster Fuller. Nobody knows who he is, so he's going to come and teach. So would you assist him? So Kenneth Snelson assists Buck Fuller and learns about his theories, and learns about particularly this theory of tensegrity, which is a theory that there is a continuous tension in the metal, the wire, metal wire, and a discontinuous compression in the solid parts. So none of these sculptures have any solid part touching another one. They only have the solid parts touching the wire, which is holding them together. And Kenneth Snelson has done these sculptures all over the world. Now, he passed away a few years ago, but in going through the papers I had of Jack Wilkinson, I found a 10-page letter that Kenneth Snelson wrote to Jack Wilkinson when he was at Black Mountain College. And in it starts out with a typewriter, then it goes to handwriting. It says, we only have one typewriter here, and we have to pass it around among the students, so I'm now passing the typewriter around. The rest of the letter will be in handwriting. Anyway, I met and had dinner with Kenneth Snelson a number of times in New York, and saw that his studio was a machine shop. I mean, he was a machinist. He had to manufacture all these metal parts, so we had metal lathes. It was like going into an engineering office. And then here's Jack Wilkinson again, who inspired him and did a number of murals. It really was quite a genius. And he ran a TV show for a while. And then here's McCosh was probably one of the most well-known painters we had, and exhibited all over the country, and also did work for the WPA. The lower part here are murals dedicated to the different parks. And so this is one of the Washington buildings. A lot of these paintings were done on canvas so they could paint them in the West and take them to the East. And that's what happened to the mural that Jack Wilkinson did for the Burns post office. It was painted in San Francisco and then hauled to Burns. Now, also you had these married couples that were often artists married other artists, but in those days it wasn't allowed for the spouse to teach. Even Alfred Schroff, when he came, his wife was a painter, accomplished painter, and she does end up teaching while Schroff is teaching. But now today, that's a big deal. They want you to bring your wife or husband, and they want them to be another part of the university. But in these days, you had David McCosh and Anne McCosh, both painters, and studied painting in New York. Then you had Una and Jack Wilkinson, who met in art school in San Francisco. Paul was a sculptor and Kay a painter. Then you have Colin Ives, a digital artist. His wife was a typographer. And then Hattie Mae was a weaver, and Max a jeweler. Leon Johnson, a multimedia artist. and Megan, a printmaker. And then there's me, as with my wife when we were married. I looked like a young kid, which I was, you know. Okay, ceramics. Now you had these different faculty that came. Again, Victoria was the first, and then Bob James takes over. She teaches for 44 years. In fact, several people were hired to replace her, but she never quit teaching, so they had the people left. they came and worked for a few years, and they thought, I'm not going to be able to teach ceramics, so I'll just move on. And then Bob did take over, and then you have George Kokas, Dave Sandard, Sana Crusoe, Dick Pickering, and Brian Gillis, who is currently one of the faculty. And this is some of Bob James's ceramics. He studied graphics at UCLA in his early days, and then before he went to Cranbrook, and so he had a graphic knowledge, and he loved doing graphic things on his pottery, drawings in different glaze ways. He usually would draw with wax and then cover it with a blue glaze so the wax would melt off and it would be a white line on it. Now here's printmaking. Again, a lot of printmaking teachers teaching lithography, silkscreen, etching, and Maud Kearns sort of being one of the early, and Isla Brown, two of the people that brought etching to the school. And here's Laverne Krauss. Some of you may have studied with her or known her. She had always maintained a studio in Portland as well as Eugene, and although she started out in the Portland area. And then here's paintings by different faculty that I've assembled and put together here. Now, and here's some more of the faculty's painting. We always had an abstract painter and a realistic painter, or a figurative painter, and so you had those choices. Hattie May was a docent at the museum, and when Joseph Albers, these are two of Joseph Albers' color studies. When he came, Hattie May was wearing a very colorful dress, and she gave him a tour of the museum, and he said, "Oh, no, Hattie, if you're going to be a docent, you have to wear white or black. You're conflicting with the color in the paintings." And so from then on, she only wore black. And so then you have now the faculty's growing, and you have usually in the 70s, a number of people are changing jobs or dying or whatever, and then or moving on, and then you have this core of people, and then a number of new people are coming on. Now, this is showing, again, work by different students as well as faculty. Bill Harsey, one of Max's students, became an international known knife maker. His knives are in museums in Japan. I mean, he's an incredible knife maker. And here you have some art studios, old studios and new studios, and Frank Okada talking to a student. And then weaving was the first area to get a computer in the art department. Dave Foster donated his computer, and we had a Jacquard loom. Not at that time we didn't have a Jacquard loom. We had an AVL loom that was driven by a computer-controlled device that would control the pedals. And usually in weaving, the different pedals drive the different shuttles that go up and down. The Jacquard loom is considered the first programmable machine because they programmed the machine with punch cards, and that gave the machine knowledge as to which one of these treadles to go up and down, so they could do complex patterns. Then in the 60s, excuse me, the 60s we have the Vietnam War, dramatic changes, student unrest, women in art. Suddenly women are emerging. The art book, one of the art books we had, Jansen for Art, did not have one woman artist in the whole history of art. And so that was going to be changed in the 60s. Photography entered into the art department. A lot of photography and film had not been in the art department. Installations began to develop, performance art, happenings, light show. And we had Morris Urowski, who kind of introduced all those things to the U of O student. He came from San Francisco, and Jack Wilkinson knew him and brought him up here to introduce us to things that were going on. And he showed us the paintings of contemporary painters like Robert Indiana and Larry Poons that were doing very interesting things that we had not seen in the art history books or in the lectures. And then the faculty invited various artists. Visiting artists program has always been an active thing, and they invited Andy Warhol to come. And yet, something was not right. When this guy, the fellow here that was supposed to be Andy Warhol, when he was taken to the airport, his wig flew off in the wind, and he didn't really look like Andy Warhol. So this article came out in the Register Guard. Was it the real Warhol? And Don Bischoff, who wrote the article and works at the Register Guard, in his staff had an old hippie who had the phone number of the pay telephone in the factory in New York where Andy Warhol was currently working. So he phones up Andy Warhol, and somebody answers and says, "Could I speak to Andy Warhol?" I said, well, I don't know where he is. We'll look around. And then suddenly Andy Warhol comes on the phone, and Don Bishop says, there's some question as to whether you actually came here to Oregon, and we don't think you did. And Warhol admits, well, okay, I'm not very good at public speaking. And then here's part of his quotes. He says, oh, well, he was better than I am. He was what people expected. They liked him better than they would have liked me, because I've been going on tours since then, and they rather have somebody else than me. So then the students said, well, okay, now you come, Andy, because we sent you money. And so Andy says, well, I'll return the money rather than come out to Oregon. So he's one guy who never came but was invited. Okay, and here to give you a flavor of the 60s and the going into the 70s, this is a typical art class where Dave Foster was teaching filmmaking. And you had students from all over campus, but the men generally had beards and long hair, and the women generally had long hair. And and that thing in the background is actually an animation stand that Dave Foster built. Dave Foster built a lot of animation stands, a lot of equipment. He loved mechanics, so he was building things all the time. In fact, he built dark rooms. We didn't have a regular dark room, so he built dark rooms all over the place. In fact, here I have a kind of tribute to the innovation of Dave Foster. He developed 7 new courses. His students made over 350 short films. And he built 12 photo labs or dark rooms. He introduced silkscreen printing. And he loved motion graphics, film and video. And he introduced film in the 60s, video in the 70s, and videos in the 70s and 80s, and computers in the 90s. No, I got it backwards. 60s, 70s. 60s, film, 70s, video, 80s, computers. Yep. So he introduced all these things. He was quite an innovator. Now, Paul Buckner, he was our figurative sculpture. And if any of you ever are in Eugene, or this is in Mount Hood, this is the Native American mother and child, and there's a pioneer mother and child. They're 3/4 regular human size in Mount Hood. This is one from the Stations of the Cross that he did a series of beautiful reliefs of Jesus carrying the cross to the Calvary, and they're in the St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Eugene. And then these are some of his other sculptures. This is a scrimshaw. This is a piano key. He wanted to carve in ivory, and he asked one of the students if they could find a piano key. Well, online they found a piano key and brought it to him. So that's the size of one piano key, and he did this drawing just from his memory. He taught anatomy for artists and was amazing. Jan Zak was the other sculpture teacher for years, and he was more of an abstract sculpture teacher, and his work was in the city hall as well. But his great dream was he was from Czechoslovakia. His great dream was to do an international sculpture symposium. Some of the sculpture you see around Eugene and at LCC was done during this symposium that lasted 6 weeks, and the sculptures could come and they would be given room and board if they would do their sculpture in a public place. And so all of these had students around. And then we had a traveling Dennis Gould helped develop a traveling exhibit show based on artwork in the basement of the museum. And then we're moving into international sculptures coming, and this is Kazutaka Uchida that just died last year from Japan, one of his carvings. And then we got into computers, and this is a computer animated film that I made. And then I helped start a computer conference. And then Craig Hickman wrote the program KidPix that some of your children may have learned to use the computer with. He wrote it for his son Ben, and he wanted it to be something his son couldn't read, so he wanted to so that there would be no system errors appearing on the screen, and that it would always go back to the program. And then I got a team together and wrote this for a Japanese school to teach English to Japanese children. And then we started doing international overseas programs in different countries. The students began to work again. One of our Mexican students set up a show and exchange between Mexico and Oregon. And then again, I had some of the additional faculty, and we're winding down here. This is some of the faculty that's still there. In fact, Anya is the head of the art department. But the faculty love to play with scale. And here's the Styrobot by Michael Salter. And then you have this jewelry and metal. Painting, here's some painting. The painters began to have the painting fall off the wall and became installation work. And then on the right is Ron Graff, figurative painting, and then abstract painting. And then so Laura Alpers, some of her abstract painting. And then a student, this is Jay Lindsay, worked on this gigantic horse that was designed by Leonardo da Vinci that was finally built in New York at the Talix Foundry. And one of our students was involved in enlarging to build the thing at its actual size. Again, sculpture you'll find in Portland and Eugene and at the hospital by our students. And this Devin Field has done sculpture in China, Mongolia, Beaverton, South Korea, Sweden. He's really an international sculptor. Our filmmaking, the students, James Ivory was a student here. He made Room with a View, in Howard's End and Surviving Picasso. And a number of our students have received Academy Awards in art directing, and Joan Gratz for her clay animation. And then students have worked at a variety of computer companies and software companies, and some student ceramics. Some of you may own some of Faith Rahill or Faye Nakamura's or Hank Merle's pottery. And Ken Shores started the art department at Lewis and Clark College. And then here, these are some paintings by some of the students, many students that we had. And this is a painting that I want to show by George Green. He died in 2020, but before he died, he put on this amazing exhibit called Visual Magic, and he had 45 painters from Oregon that had started in the 60s and were still painting. That many of them have passed away since that exhibit. But he is credited as inventing abstract illusionist painting, so that what you see up here, first he was doing rectangular things, and then at one period the canvas was being cut up. He would use wood panels for the canvas, and here he's using a wood panel. Everything you see is painted. Everything that's there is painted on the surface, but it floats above it. Okay, and many books and magazines written about the faculty, and I end with this photograph of them. Thank you very much. Lots of interesting stories.